Jeremy Clarkson just went nuclear on live television, and what he said about Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves has sent shockwaves across Britain. The cameras were rolling, the studio went silent, and in those few brutal minutes, Clarkson delivered a verbal demolition that nobody saw coming. This wasn't just another celebrity having a go at politicians. This was personal, this was raw, and this was absolutely devastating. What pushed Britain's most outspoken presenter to unleash such a ferocious attack? The answer involves farmers, inheritance tax, and a government policy that Clarkson claims will destroy the backbone of rural Britain. Buckle up, because what you're about to hear will leave you stunned. The television studio lights were blazing as Jeremy Clarkson sat across from the panel, and you could see it in his eyes. This wasn't going to be a polite chat. This was going to be war. For weeks, tensions had been building between Clarkson and the Labour government ever since Chancellor Rachel Reeves dropped her autumn budget bombshell. The policy that lit the fuse, a catastrophic change to agricultural inheritance tax that threatens to obliterate family farms across the country. Clarkson, who owns Diddley Squat Farm in Oxfordshire, wasn't just speaking as a celebrity anymore. He was speaking as a farmer, and he was furious. The moment the interview began, Clarkson didn't waste time with pleasantries. He went straight for the jugular, targeting both Prime Minister Keir Starmer and Chancellor Rachel Reeves with a precision that only someone who's been holding back their anger could deliver. His voice was steady, but there was fire behind every word. He called the government's policy catastrophic, short-sighted, and nothing short of an attack on British farming heritage. The inheritance tax changes, he explained it, would force families who have worked the same land for generations to sell up just to pay the taxman. These aren't wealthy aristocrats sitting in mansions counting their money. These are hard-working families who wake up at dawn, work until their bodies ache, and go to bed worrying about whether they can keep their land for their children. Clarkson's fury wasn't just about numbers and policies, it was deeply personal. He spoke about the farmers he knows, the ones who are now lying awake at night, doing impossible calculations, trying to figure out how they can possibly afford to pass their farms to the next generation. He painted a picture of communities being ripped apart, of centuries-old farms being broken up and sold off to property developers or corporations. This is the end of family farming as we know it, Clarkson declared, and the people responsible are sitting in Westminster pretending they've done something noble. The audience was gripped. Some nodded in agreement, others sat with jaws dropped, but nobody could look away. Then Clarkson turned his sights directly on Keir Starmer. He didn't hold back. He accused the Prime Minister of being completely out of touch with rural communities, of never having set foot on a working farm, of making decisions that affect millions of people without understanding the first thing about their lives. Clarkson's words cut deep. He suggested that Starmer and his cabinet view farmers as nothing more than wealthy landowners who need to pay their fair share, completely ignoring the reality that most farmers are asset rich but cash poor. They might own valuable land, but they're not swimming in money. They're barely scraping by, dealing with rising costs, unpredictable weather, and now a government that seems determined to tax them out of existence. The presenter's anger reached a crescendo when he addressed Rachel Reeves directly. Clarkson called her budget a disaster, a policy dreamed up by people who have never had dirt under their fingernails or understood what it means to work the land. He accused the Chancellor of economic vandalism, of sacrificing rural Britain on the altar of political ideology. The inheritance tax changes, Clarkson argued, aren't about fairness or making the wealthy pay more. They're about squeezing money out of people who can't afford it, who will have no choice but to sell their heritage, their history and their future. And for what? To fill a hole in the government's budget while destroying an entire way of life in the process. What made Clarkson's attack so devastating wasn't just the passion or the anger. It was the facts he brought to the table. He didn't just rant and rave. He came prepared. He explained how the previous inheritance tax relief allowed family farms to be passed down without crippling tax bills, recognising that farms are businesses that need to stay intact to survive. Under the new rules, farms worth over a certain threshold will face massive tax bills that most families simply cannot afford to pay. The only option will be to sell land, equipment or entire farms. And once that land is sold, It's gone forever. No more family farming, no more local food production, no more connection to the land that has sustained communities for centuries. Clarkson's words resonated far beyond that television studio. Within minutes, social media exploded. Farmers across Britain shared his comments, adding their own stories of desperation and fear. Urban viewers who had never thought much about farming suddenly understood the crisis unfolding in the countryside. Support for Clarkson's position flooded in from all corners. Even people who disagreed with him on other issues found themselves nodding along, recognising the genuine anger and concern in his voice. This wasn't manufactured outrage for ratings. This was real, and it was powerful. But Clarkson wasn't finished, not by a long shot. He turned his attention to the broader implications of the government's approach. He argued that this policy reveals something darker about how Labour views rural communities. They're seen as obstacles, as outdated relics that need to be modernised out of existence. The people who grow our food, who maintain our countryside, who keep rural villages alive are being treated as inconvenient problems rather than essential contributors to national life. Clarkson's voice grew more intense as he warned that this is just the beginning. If the government can destroy family farming with a stroke of a pen, what else will they target? What other traditions, communities and ways of life will be sacrificed for political convenience? The interview became a cultural moment. News outlets scrambled to cover it. Political commentators weighed in. Government ministers were forced to respond. But none of them could match the raw authenticity of Clarkson's fury. He had spoken for millions who felt ignored, dismissed and betrayed. And he had done it in a way that was impossible to ignore. The battle lines were drawn, and Jeremy Clarkson had just fired the opening shot in what promises to be a brutal war between rural Britain and a government that seems determined to ignore their cries for help. The aftermath of Clarkson's explosive interview spread like wildfire across every corner of British media and beyond. Within hours, his words had been clipped, shared and replayed millions of times across social media platforms. Farmers who had felt isolated and helpless suddenly realised they weren't alone in their anger. Urban viewers who had never considered the realities of agricultural life found themselves confronting uncomfortable truths about where their food comes from and who produces it. The government had expected their inheritance tax policy to slip through with minimal resistance, perhaps some grumbling from farming unions and a few protests that would fade from headlines within days. What they got instead was a full-scale revolt, and Jeremy Clarkson had become its most visible and vocal champion. His status as a household name meant that his words reached far beyond the usual agricultural circles, penetrating into living rooms and dinner table conversations across the entire nation. The numbers behind Clarkson's fury painted a devastating picture that the government couldn't simply dismiss or spin away. Under the new inheritance tax rules, farms valued above £1 million would face a 20% tax on anything above that threshold. To most city dwellers, £1 million sounds like vast wealth, the kind of money that justifies serious taxation. But in farming, the reality is completely different and far more complex. A relatively modest family farm with a few hundred acres, some basic equipment and a farmhouse can easily exceed that valuation without generating anywhere near enough income to pay a massive tax bill. The land itself holds value on paper, but that value is locked up in fields, barns and machinery that are essential for the farm to function. You cannot sell half a field to pay a tax bill and expect the farm to remain viable. The equipment cannot be divided up and sold off without crippling the farm's ability to operate. These families are caught in an impossible situation, asset rich on paper, but cash poor in reality, facing tax bills that could run into hundreds of thousands of pounds with no realistic way to pay them without destroying everything their families have built over generations. Clarkson methodically dismantled every argument the government had made in defence of their policy when ministers claimed this would only affect the wealthiest landowners. Clarkson pointed to real families, real farms, and real situations where ordinary working farmers would be devastated. When the government suggested farmers could simply take out loans to pay the tax bills, Clarkson exploded with rage at the absurdity of expecting families already struggling with thin profit margins to burden themselves with crushing debt just to keep land their families have worked for centuries. When politicians argued this was about fairness and making sure everyone pays their share, Clarkson countered that there was nothing fair about forcing people to sell their heritage and their livelihoods to satisfy bureaucrats in Westminster who wouldn't know one end of a cow from the other. His arguments weren't just emotional appeals, they were backed by cold, hard economics and the lived experience of farming communities that politicians had clearly never bothered to understand or even consider. The political establishment scrambled to respond but found themselves completely outmanoeuvred by Clarkson's combination of celebrity platform and genuine agricultural credibility. Government ministers appeared on news programmes trying to defend the policy, but their carefully prepared talking points sounded hollow and disconnected when placed alongside Clarkson's passionate and detailed condemnation. They spoke in abstractions about fairness and tax revenue. Clarkson spoke about families losing their homes and communities being destroyed. They referenced economic models and fiscal projections. Clarkson talked about farmers weeping as they contemplated selling land their great-grandparents had worked. The contrast was devastating for the government, and they knew it. Even some Labour backbenchers began privately expressing concerns about the policy, worried about the electoral consequences of being seen as the party that destroyed British farming. Rural constituencies that had narrowly swung to Labour in the previous election suddenly looked vulnerable, and nervous MPs started calculating whether supporting this policy was worth losing their seats over. Clarkson's attack had also exposed a deeper cultural divide that had been simmering beneath British politics for years. Urban voters, who make up the majority of the electorate, often have little direct connection to farming or rural life. To them, farmers can seem like a privileged minority sitting on valuable land while complaining about having to contribute more to society. This perception, carefully cultivated by some politicians and media outlets, makes it easier to push through policies that harm rural communities because the political cost seems minimal. But Clarkson had managed to bridge that divide in a way that politicians and farming unions had struggled to do for decades. His fame and his television work had given millions of urban viewers a window into farming life through shows like Clarkson's Farm, where they watched him struggle with bureaucracy, weather disasters, and the brutal economics of modern agriculture. They had seen that farming wasn't some idyllic lifestyle of wealthy landowners. It was hard, often unrewarding work carried out by people who genuinely love the land and the life despite all its challenges. When Clarkson spoke about the inheritance tax threatening to destroy family farms, these viewers understood what was at stake in a way they never would have before. The government had miscalculated badly, assuming they could push through this policy without serious resistance. Instead, they had triggered a cultural and political firestorm that showed no signs of burning out. The reverberations from Clarkson's devastating critique extended far beyond television screens and social media feeds, triggering a nationwide reckoning about the future of British agriculture and the communities that depend on it. Farmers who had spent their entire lives quietly working the land, rarely seeking attention or engaging in political activism, suddenly found themselves transformed into frontline warriors in a battle for their very survival. Tractors began appearing in town squares across rural Britain as impromptu protests erupted in villages and market towns. These weren't professional activists or career protesters. These were third and fourth generation farmers, men and women with weathered faces and calloused hands, people who had never imagined they would need to fight their own government just to keep doing what their families had done for centuries. The scenes were powerful and deeply moving. Elderly farmers standing beside their tractors, holding homemade signs. Young families bringing their children to protest because they wanted them to understand that their inheritance, their birthright, was being stolen by bureaucrats who had never planted a seed or delivered a calf in the dead of winter. Clarkson's words had crystallised something that farming communities had struggled to articulate for years. A growing sense that they were being deliberately marginalised and pushed aside by a political establishment that viewed them as relics of a bygone era. The inheritance tax was just the latest and most devastating in a long series of policies that seemed designed to make farming economically unviable for anyone except massive corporate agricultural operations. Environmental regulations, while often well-intentioned, had piled administrative burdens and costs onto family farms without providing adequate support or compensation. Trade deals negotiated after Brexit had opened British markets to cheaper foreign imports, produced under lower standards, undercutting local farmers who were held to much stricter requirements. Supermarket chains wielded enormous power over pricing, squeezing farmers' margins to levels that made profitability almost impossible, while simultaneously demanding higher standards and more traceability. Through all of this, farmers had endured, adapted, and carried on because they loved the land and the life. But the inheritance tax felt different. It felt like a death sentence, a policy specifically designed to ensure that family farming would cease to exist within a generation or two. The government's response to the growing crisis only made matters worse and showed just how disconnected ministers were from the reality on the ground. Rachel Reeves attempted to defend her budget by arguing that the inheritance tax changes would only affect a small percentage of farms and that adequate reliefs and exemptions existed for those who planned carefully. This response revealed either stunning ignorance or deliberate deception about how farming actually works. The valuations that trigger the tax thresholds include not just land, but equipment, livestock, buildings and homes, meaning that even modest family operations easily exceed the limits. The so-called planning options, the government suggested, such as gifting land to children years in advance, were either impractical for families who needed to maintain control of their operations until retirement, or potentially devastating if health issues or unexpected circumstances arose. Reeves spoke as if farming families were simply being difficult or refusing to engage with reasonable tax planning, completely missing the point that these families shouldn't need expensive accountants and complex legal structures just to pass on a working farm to the next generation. The agricultural property relief that had existed for decades wasn't a loophole or a tax dodge. It was the recognition that farms are fundamentally different from other assets, that they represent living businesses and cultural heritage that benefit the entire nation, not just the families who work them. Keir Starmer's silence throughout the crisis spoke volumes and fed growing suspicions that the government simply didn't care about rural communities or their concerns. While Clarkson and farmers were making headlines and protests were spreading, the Prime Minister remained largely absent from the debate, leaving his Chancellor to face the criticism alone. When Starmer finally did address the issue, his comments were brief, defensive and utterly unconvincing. He repeated the same talking points about fairness and making sure everyone paid their share, showing no understanding of or interest in the specific challenges facing family farms. Political commentators noted that Starmer's government seemed to be making a calculated decision that rural votes didn't matter enough to worry about, that they could afford to alienate farming communities because the electoral math still worked in their favour. This cynical calculation might prove correct in the short term, but it revealed something deeply troubling about the government's priorities and values. Democracy functions best when all communities feel heard and represented, when their concerns are taken seriously, even if they don't have the numbers to swing elections. By dismissing farming families as acceptable collateral damage in pursuit of tax revenue, Starmer's government was betraying fundamental principles of fairness and representation. Clarkson continued to press his advantage, appearing on additional programmes and platforms to hammer home his message and ensure the issue remained in the public eye. He brought other farmers onto his shows, giving them platforms to tell their personal stories in ways that statistics and policy papers never could. One particularly powerful segment featured a fourth-generation dairy farmer in his 60s, close to retirement, explaining through tears that he would now have to sell the farm rather than pass it to his son because the inheritance tax bill would exceed anything they could possibly afford. Another featured a young woman who had given up a career in the city to return home and take over her family's sheep farm, only to realise that when her parents died, she would face a tax bill that would force her to sell the very land she had sacrificed everything to preserve. These weren't abstract policy debates anymore. They were real people with real lives being destroyed by government decisions. And Clarkson made sure the entire country saw their faces and heard their stories. The emotional impact was devastating and impossible to ignore.